Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this panel on climate change and natural resource governance in Afghanistan. My name is Reza Pirbhai. I'm a faculty member at Georgetown University in Qatar, and it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce you to our panelists this afternoon, which I'll do in order of their addresses. So we'll begin with Ambassador Androulla Kaminara, who served as the ambassador and head of the delegation of the European Union to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan from 2019 to 2022. She is also an associate editor of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, Transactions on Technology and Society Journal. During more than 2 decades with the European Commission and European External Action Service, she served as principal advisor and head of the task force Knowledge, Performance and Results in the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development, Europe Aid. She also held the position of Director of Operations covering Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific in the Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations. And earlier in her career, she was head of the European Commission representation in Cyprus and a director for quality of operations in Europe Aid, overseeing the quality of development cooperation operations of the EU to third countries. We are also pleased to welcome Dr. Assem Mayar, who is an Afghan scientist researching water resources management, climate change, floods, drought, and food security in Afghanistan. Dr. Mayar previously served as a lecturer at Kabul Polytechnic University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research in Munkberg, Germany. Dr. Mayar has several publications, including detailed policy and strategy analysis of tackling climate change and drought risk mitigation in Afghanistan. And finally, Dr. Matt Reed is the Global Director of Institutional Partnerships for the Aga Khan Foundation, responsible for coordinating the Foundation's strategic partnerships with bilateral, multilateral, foundation, and corporate partners worldwide. He has been CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK since 2016. Dr. Reed has worked with the Aga Khan Development Network since 2009, serving as Director of Programs at AKF UK in London and CEO of AKF India in Delhi. Previously, he worked at the Getty Research Institute, the Salzburg Seminar, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Keck Graduate Institute at the Claremont Colleges. So it's a great pleasure to welcome all 3 speakers here today. Before I invite Ambassador Kaminara to the podium, I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping. We will have a question and answer session after all the speakers have addressed the audience. If you have a question, please scan the Q code on your table and enter your question, and that will then be relayed to me to pose to the panelists. So without further ado, Ambassador Kaminara, please.
Thank you very much, Reza, and thank you very much for having the opportunity to address this conference. I will briefly touch on 4 topics and then try and have some suggestions about the future. So the first point I want to talk to is about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. It's the world's biggest crisis. We've seen an increase over the last 5 years of about 480% in the needs of the people on the ground. 29 million people in need of aid. We are in a situation where for the third consecutive year we have droughts, economic decline, which is very, very steep, and we're also seeing the effects of decades of conflict in the country. With respect to response to humanitarian needs under the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, you have a humanitarian plan. And in the case of Afghanistan, the needs and the amount of funding that is available is only 25% of what is forecasted to be necessary to address the situation in the country. Humanitarian plans are never 100% or almost never 100% financed, but I think it's interesting to say and underline that in the case of Afghanistan, the amount of funding vis-a-vis the total amount of needs is much, much less than certain other crises. So we've seen, let's say, less of a focus on providing humanitarian assistance in the case of Afghanistan than by comparison to some other countries. Now, on top of that underlying humanitarian disaster, you have flash flooding. We've had the droughts, we've had the earthquake recently, and very, very recently there's been the large number of returnees that used to be in Pakistan returning to Afghanistan. So it's a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis. So that's in a nutshell the situation on humanitarian. With respect to looking at particularly the children, 3 million children are suffering from acute malnutrition, and there's very high risk of quite a large number of children being stunted. I mention this because, of course, one of the most important issues discussed vis-a-vis Afghanistan right now is the issue of girls' education. I think we have to keep in mind that the first thing is keeping the girls and the boys, of course, not stunted, and then look at their education, because if a child is stunted, their prospects for the future are greatly decreased. So natural resources, my second point. Of course, Afghanistan is blessed with a lot of natural resources. It is estimated that $1 trillion worth of natural resources exist in Afghanistan, but currently Afghanistan major exports are in carpets or dried fruit. So currently that wealth is not being used in order to provide a better living for Afghans. Recently, there was, of course, this number of contracts that have been signed for with the mining companies. One of the concerns is, are those contracts going to provide as much relief to the Afghan population as possible? Again, with respect to natural resources, and I link it in also to the issue of women, the mining sector is the sector which is most labor intensive and has the highest percentage of male jobs rather than female jobs globally. So if the future or part of the future wealth of Afghanistan is going to come from mining, we have to also keep in mind the issue of how does that affect the role of women. The other point I want to just briefly touch upon in order to draw some conclusions is the effect of the massive decrease in the production of poppy in Afghanistan, with a drastic reduction of production of poppy. This is, of course, something that we all welcome. However, that has a drop in $1 billion in revenue, which is, again, something good is happening because there's less production of illicit drugs, but that is having an additional problem on the economy, and that is adding to the various humanitarian problems that already exist. There is an increased danger of food insecurity, also because of this change that has happened recently. Now, climate change vulnerability, so on top of all of those layers, Afghanistan is the fourth most vulnerable country globally to climate change. And that is nothing to do with what the Afghans are doing or the political situation. Is a result of their geography. In the context of the COP discussions on climate change, there was a proposal to put in place a loss and damage fund, which would compensate or at least try and help countries that are most vulnerable to climate change to stand on their own 2 feet. Unfortunately, this loss and damage fund is not sure they will materialize, it's still in negotiations. And if and when, inshallah, it does take place, Afghanistan should not be forgotten as a potential country for receiving funds as a result of its vulnerabilities to climate change. Just to give you an idea, in 2021, 39% of households reported their biggest problems resulting from climate change. In 2022, 64% of households were saying that some of their biggest problem was linked to that. And if that was not enough of a problem, since 2021, there was, of course, a significant reduction in development cooperation funding going to Afghanistan, which depended to a large extent on foreign aid to support the needs of the population. So with this as a background and as an overview, what are the problems, allow me to have some suggestions of what could potentially be done. With respect to foreign aid, I think there is a need to use all tools as possible, all tools that the rest of the world has in its hands, as flexible as possible. I think we need to work in the gray zone. Nothing is totally black and not totally white. We need to work in the gray zone and try and adapt whatever means we have to the needs on the ground. And the issues, of course, of recognition and the other more political topics can be handled differently. With respect to climate change, as I've already mentioned, when, and I'm an optimist, when the loss and damage fund of COP is actually put in place, not to ignore the needs of Afghanistan, not to consider that because of the other problems we may have with Afghanistan that leave the Afghans out of the equation. What their vulnerability has nothing to do with who's in power or what they did. It's a vulnerability that comes from the geography and what the whole of the world has been doing. With respect to the management of natural resources, country after country in the world where they've started to try and develop their natural resources, there are many, many examples of shortcomings in that development of natural resources, simply because this is a very, very complex field, and the capacity of those countries was not up to par with the capacity of the companies that are negotiating these contracts. So I cannot speak about the capacity of the Afghans to negotiate these contracts, but I know that there was a huge brain drain in the past. I know that other countries which didn't have to live through such major shocks, despite their best efforts, had problems with this issue. So if there was one thing that I could dream about, would be to provide technical support, to bring the experts in this field that may be necessary to negotiate better contracts, both on the economic side, but also on the climate change, environmental implications of these contracts, and try and help these negotiations go in a way that it will be much more beneficial to all Afghans. And fourthly, if there's something we need to do, is also to, in the current global context where there's so many crises on the international radar screen, to try and put Afghanistan back on that radar screen so that it does not lose the potential support it may have from the global powers. And at the end of the day, ensuring that the children of Afghanistan, both girls and boys, that we help minimize the possibility that they're malnourished and stunted, so that they might have a future of themselves, be able to be educated, inshallah, and contribute to the future of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaminara. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Assem Mayar, please, to address us.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I thank and appreciate the Georgetown University for making this event and allowing us to represent the voice of Afghanistan. I would like to talk, and I also thank Ambassador for explaining the large context of the impasse. But there are, particularly as the session is related to the climate change, I would focus only on this issue. As Ambassador explained, there are multiple challenges, and one of them is the food security. And particularly the food security issue is related to the climate change, because it's the climate that brings drought and floods, which leads to challenges. As there is more young generation, I would like to first explain what the climate change is and why this 1.5 degrees of global warming affect the most vulnerable countries like in Afghanistan. Honestly, to make it simple, I resemble the climate change problem to a fever that every one of you may have already experienced. The natural temperature of your human body is 37 degrees. And when you are sick, it rises to 38 degrees or 38.5 degrees. So this 1.5 degrees of heat disrupts your natural life, and that affects you. The similar thing is, that if this fever continues for more than 3 days, the medical doctor says that the patient could die. So, but fortunately, we have painkillers and medicine for urgently stopping the fever. However, for our global warming, we do not have such medicine. So that's why the entire world has committed through the Paris Agreement to support adaptation programs. And that means that we are supporting or giving a supportive medicine to the sick or the patient in order to improve his resilience with this challenge. So coming to the specific Afghanistan's case, the climate change is an umbrella for multiple challenges. It's not only 1.5 degrees of heat. It affects the country in multiple ways. First of all, it affects the water cycle. Afghanistan has very less infrastructure for the regulation of water. And previously, the snow in the mountains was serving as a natural reservoirs. They were melting in the summer and irrigating agriculture in order to produce food. So now, with this 1.5 degrees of heat, the snow melts 2 months early, and that is affecting the agriculture. The second issue is the drought. Now the frequency of the drought in Afghanistan is twice or doubled. So if you look the past 5 or 6 years, Afghanistan experienced severe drought in 2018, in 2017, as well as from 2021 to current now, 2023. So during a drought, Afghanistan's agricultural productivity reduces about 30%, and the country's GDP also is coming from, or depends on agriculture sector, about 36%. So if we multiply these two, it's only the climate change or the drought that's induced by climate change affects the country's GDP about 10%. So I can recall the World Bank report that was for 2022, which cited that Afghanistan's agriculture was reduced, or sorry, the GDP was reduced 6.6% only because of the drought. So this is, you see, the 2022 case, and 2023 is yet to come. So because of the climate change, this drought would become a norm in 2030. That's why the country needs preparation. The second consequence of the climate change is flood. Afghanistan experienced river floods or spring floods. So it's predicted that next year Afghanistan will experience severe floods again. But if it is a drought, Afghanistan also experiences flood due to the seasonal monsoon precipitation in the summer. So the country is unable to store that water, and that's why it's affecting the social and economical society of Afghanistan. Another consequence is the forest fire. In the past years, Afghanistan experienced multiple forest fires. And to make my speech short, there is also sandstorms that affects or even causes breathing problems for the people. So there is 2 regions for such sandstorms. One is in the west from Helmand, and another one is the Aral Sea. It brings sandstorms even to the northern province of Afghanistan, as well as sometimes it passes through the Kabul. So I will also talk about its governance, and the problem is that previously during the Republic, Afghanistan was allowed or able to apply for the adaptation funds, which the countries require. And according to the nationally determined contribution, Afghanistan's proposed this document to the UNFCCC, and they expected $1 billion per year until 2023. However, the government was unable to secure this fund or receive this fund. That's why third-party organizations like the UN agencies, World Bank, and other accredited organizations were supporting Afghanistan to receive such funds from this for adaptation projects. According to some statistics that I have used in my publications, previously Afghanistan was receiving about 300 millions of these funds. But since the collapse of the Republic, all of these vital projects were suspended. So recently I got a statistics from the NEPA that they said that there were 32 projects suspended, and they're totally worth about 826 millions. So during the past 3 years, Afghanistan is again affected by the climate change, as I said, about 6 or 7% of the GDP, but it does not receive any adaptation fund. And the main reason for this is two. One is the sanctions, and another one is the non-recognitions that the international organizations do not want to work with the current administration. So the solution is either to do a compromise or split the climate change funds, which is channeled through the SDGs. And the SDGs are labeled as a development aid, and they are under the sanctions protocols. So that's why now the country is affected by the climate change and it's not receiving the funds. So I will stop here. Later we will describe more if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayar. And last but not least, Dr. Matt Reed.
Well, thank you all for coming out today, and thank you to Georgetown for inviting me. I think maybe, but I was asked to speak about the effect of climate change on the ground and the things that we're seeing in our programs. I think maybe before I do that, I would just start by asking ourselves, well, why is it that we're talking about climate change right now in the context of a conference on confronting the impasse? I think the reason that we wanted to focus on climate change in this session is because the impasse right now is that the international community, because of its objections to the current de facto administration, has limited itself very, very narrowly to humanitarian assistance, period, or possibly basic needs. So that means that none of this long-term development assistance that Dr. Mayar was talking about or that Androulla was talking about is happening. It means that there's a very short-term focus in the country. And of course, as you can hear, there are deeply acute humanitarian needs. But when we step back, we have to see those humanitarian needs as the product not only of an immediate crisis following the fall of Kabul, but also linked to this longer-term issue of climate change. And so what I'd like to do is situate the humanitarian crisis and the climate crisis together and talk a little bit about how we ought to be working smarter in Afghanistan over the next several years in order to build the country's resilience. So the first, we've already talked a little bit about the effects of climate or the issue of climate change. Generally, you've heard about what the trends are. The scale of the crisis, as Androulla said, essentially 2/3 of the country needs humanitarian assistance. 15 million people are in acute food insecurity. That's almost 1/3 of the country. Now, where we work as AKF, the situation is quite dire. So we're in the Central Highlands and in the northeast of the country. In our household surveys, half of the population in the places we work are either in what's called IPC 3, so in a crisis situation, or IPC 4, which is an emergency situation, just to give you a sense of how deeply they need food assistance. 81% of households are either borderline or actually in that food insecurity. 70% of them are adopting what we call negative coping strategies. They're skipping meals, they're not eating enough, they're not eating the right kinds of things. The World Bank says that there's food in the market, but actually nobody can buy them. So there's also a purchasing power problem. Now, how is this related to climate change? I think it's important to remember that 70% of Afghanistan is rural, that 80% of those households depend on agriculture in one way or another for their livelihoods, and 50% of the population is completely dependent on agriculture or on livestock. So you can automatically start doing the math. If you have a 35% drop in agricultural productivity, you have 3 years of drought, you can see how, if the entire economy is dependent on agriculture, how that is feeding this current humanitarian crisis. And I think it underscores why Afghanistan in particular is so sensitive to climate climate change generally. That's why it's the sixth most affected or vulnerable country in the world. Even worse, during the last 3 years, there's been none of the regular maintenance work that needs to happen. So at the agricultural level, so when you're at a community level, the way it works is that things like irrigation canals, water canals, channels, those sorts of things, they have to be regularly cleaned, maintained. There's constantly landslides that are blocking them. There might be flooding that's damaged the walls, etc. So on an annual basis, you need to be doing maintenance work in that sort of thing. That work has largely stopped for the last 2 years, mostly because of this long-term development assistance that's not happening, but also because as you've had the emergency food assistance, so therefore farmers have felt like either they don't need to plant or they can't plant because they haven't had the agricultural inputs. So that means they're not actually tilling their fields, they're not actually working those things, and so you have a self-perpetuating cycle, so a sort of downward spiral, if you will, in the midst of a wider downward spiral. So how is AKF, the Aga Khan Foundation, responding to this work? And I should say, we're by no means alone in this. I've got colleagues here from the International Rescue Committee, from the Swedish Committee on Afghanistan. I'm sure there are other NGOs in the room doing extraordinary work to address this crisis and to do whatever we can in the midst of a short-term focus to start building a little bit of resilience. So AKF directly serves 5.3 million people every year in 12,000 communities. We're directly working in 11 provinces and then with partners in another 17 provinces. So that means that our activities are present in about 24 total provinces and 124 districts. So it's a fairly extensive program. Across all of that, what we're trying to do is build community institutions. It's very important that as we do this humanitarian work, it's not just us, it's not just our organizations, but that we're helping communities build their own institutional capacity to help themselves when we go away or when the development funding goes away, etc. I think it's important to say that there are a number of these institutions that were built up during the Republic times that are still active. And that's what many of us are basing our current response on. Focusing on those sorts of institutions and on this resilience, again, is quite important because you have to have these shock absorbers. So what are the sorts of things that we're doing? Well, first of all, we're trying to harness the humanitarian assistance with a resilience lens in mind. So for example, right now, under UN Ops, we're doing a lot of cash for work programs. Every day, 40,000 people are employed through these cash for work programs. Well, we're directing those programs at certain kinds of things, the irrigation canals, cleanup of waterways, those sorts of things, so that we're somehow trying to build some bit of climate resilience into work despite the lack of the longer term development work. We're focusing on things like grain banks, so that you have some sort of stores, not only for future planting seasons, but also, frankly, for these moments when people don't have enough food. We're looking at, agriculture and livelihood, livestock inputs, that sort of things. What we call asset creation, so actually planting orchards or poultry farms or kitchen gardens and greenhouses, those sorts of things. Things that, again, when the aid stops, will allow people and communities to still rely on something locally. Again, a focus on this small and resilient infrastructure is very, very important. It's something we need to do a lot more of. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we're trying within a crisis that is, frankly, within an ongoing humanitarian crisis, but where, as development organizations, we're handcuffed. So we're not allowed necessarily with international funding to do the kinds of things that we ought to be doing to help protect communities and help build their capacity. But within that, if we work smartly, just like our other colleagues are doing at other institutions, we can, in fact, help build and make Afghanistan a bit more resilient and able to survive this current crisis and, I think, the current impasse, if you will. Thank you.
My thanks to all three speakers for their insights. Please, a reminder that if you have any questions, scan the QR code on your table and they'll reach me over here. But to kick things off, let me assume chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions of my own. I was wondering first, Professor Dr. Reed, are there any ways in which the community engagement that the Aga Khan Foundation is engaging in is also thinking in terms of indigenous knowledge as a means by which to combat the kinds of climate issues that have been outlined?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of this work that we're doing is we're talking about building community institutions. It's about bringing local people together in farmer user groups, in water user associations, a lot of women's savings groups, and other kinds of women's, say, entrepreneurial groups. One of the things that is important when you're talking about climate change work is that they themselves are able to do the, quote, climate monitoring, right? So it's, yes, we're relying on scientific studies of the kind that Dr. Mayar was talking about, but a lot of it is for them to understand that climate sensitivity and to begin thinking about and adapting themselves and I guess iterating, if you will, how do we need to change the planting season here? What are the sorts of things we ought to be doing? I think the other thing that's quite important and that we didn't talk about so much is, well, actually Dr. Mayar talked about flooding. We talked about landslides. So there's a lot of predictive work that can go into understanding either, is the flooding season changing? So for example, one of the things that's happening now is that glacial bursts are much more frequent than they ever used to be. They're happening earlier, et cetera. Those are things that we pick up on, not necessarily only through scientific measurement, but it's through communities on the ground who have that feel for what's happening. So the whole point of endowing, if you will, these institutions with that capacity and the ability to work is to allow them to adapt.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mayar, in terms of water resource management, in earlier years, I'm sure that Afghanistan was signatory to various water resource management treaties with neighboring states and so on. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit of how those treaties have remained in place or evolved given the changing political conditions in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will come to that one, but I think everyone would expect that why Afghanistan needs support because of tackling the climate change. I would like to tell that this is a global problem, and this is an issue of the development countries that is influencing or affecting Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's contribution to the greenhouse emission gases are 0.2%, less than very, very small, but as was told, it's affected a lot, and this is ranked 6th vulnerable country to this phenomenon. Regarding the treaties, Afghanistan has only one treaty with Iran on the Helmand River, and the Helmand River basin is one of the most affected basin from the climate change. Dr. Reed and AKF is working on the central and eastern part of Afghanistan, which is less affected by the climate change. It's now thanks to the satellite images that we have access to, and through that we measure the amount or the effects of the climate change on the water and agriculture sector. So Helmand Basin is also affected through the temperature rise, which also increase the crop water requirements. So once the temperature is high, it evaporates more water, and irrigating more agriculture leaves the downstream side out of water. So we have seen through the drought years that Iran was not receiving the sufficient amount of water that they expect. So that's why tension rise between these two countries. So you see, there is a nexus, or there is a link between the climate change and also the conflicts, tension, and internal displacement. Because of this drought that was induced by climate change, I have statistics that there were people displaced from the Helmand province, which might be some people here available. So because of the lack of water. And in Nimruz, people do not have access to drinking water. Similarly, in Farah, there was a Tulu News documentary that documented 2,000 families displacement. So this is all because of the recent change that the community can itself not adopt them to the changes. So the changes are rapid than how the people understand it and to adopt it themselves. So one side is the challenge, and the other side is a lack of governance through this challenge. So it brings inequality into the community. So the upstream receives more water and the downstreams are deprived. So that's why it leads to displacement. And according to the statistics, in 2018, there was also drought. The internal displacement people because of the drought was about 300,000, an equivalent or more amount than those who were displaced by the war. So this is how the challenge is and how big is it. But there are still problems and lack of the capacity to receive the adaptation fund and implement projects. The country requires to not only the funds, because if someone is doing something, he needs to have a financial support for doing that. So if we expect the people to do themselves, it's not justifiable or justice. Because once the challenge is external, it's not they didn't build this challenge, it's external, as I said earlier. And on the other side, they do not have that capacity in order to they produce or their own food daily for daily life, or they should contribute or tackle the consequences of climate change. So that's why the country highly require this adaptation support. And I think from my point of view, I was expecting the international community to work with that de facto administration on this issue, as this is a very common challenge that entire world is facing, and this could be a start of the collaboration. But due to political changes, due to policies, unfortunately, it has still not happened.
Thank you so much. And Ambassador Kaminara, are you aware of any proposals or initiatives that have come from the Taliban regime to try and address the multiple issues that we've been discussing?
As I am not dealing with Afghanistan in the last couple of years, I was in Pakistan, I would not have knowledge of such initiatives. However, I think since the whole international community is engaging with Afghanistan, the whole international community is saying that we want to see changes, particular changes, the issue of education keeps coming up. I think we should not just stop there, but look further back on dealing with some of these issues that we have said. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and that's why one of my proposals was with the issue of making better use of the natural resources that Afghanistan is blessed with. I have worked in other countries, particularly in Africa, when governments are trying to do those, to utilize their natural resources, and even with the best intentions, because these are very, very complex negotiations, things can go drastically wrong. And I think it would be a win-win, both for the Afghan people, but also for the international community that wants to see a change, if somehow on a technical level, it's not recognition, but on a technical level, we could support Afghanistan to have better contracts, so in a way to help them help themselves. So.
Thank you very much. The questions are pouring in, so let me see what I can start at the beginning with. A question for you, Dr. Reed. Could you share how the Aga Khan Foundation ensures inclusivity in its programs in specific areas in a diverse population like Afghanistan's?
Sure. So, I mean, a couple of ways. I mean, one is that we have essentially a basic protocol, is that anywhere we go, we help form village organizations, right? So these are representative groups, and the rule essentially that we have is that everybody in that community who lives in that community, representatives of every group in that community need to participate in those groups in order for them to have broad legitimacy. So wherever we work with everyone who's present. So that is just a fundamental, not only value, but a practical organizational principle of the way that we do that work. I think the second thing is that that applies equally to women and men. So we ensure that if in some parts of Afghanistan, it is possible to have groups that are mixed, women and men together, right, working. In some parts of the country, that's more difficult. So we would tend to form dual groups. So we might form, let's say it's a water users association or something else. You know, you would have a women's group and a men's group comparing information. Then you would share, in effect, you have somebody who's a go-between who can share the information from the women's group with the men's group and vice versa, so that you ensure that there is still some kind of communication, et cetera, so that you get that inclusivity. But generally, if it's possible, we'd like them to be working together, et cetera. I hope that gives a sense of how we try to do that. I should say, I mean, the other thing that's really important for us across all of the work that we do is to ensure that women's empowerment, that women have a role in these things. So for example, I talked about the food security work that we're doing. Well, we do that because we work with about 6,000 women-only community-based savings groups. Each one of those groups has about 15 or 20 women in them. So, so that's what, 75,000 women across those 12,000 villages. They are the ones that help ensure and identify the women in those villages who need food, the women-led households or widow households that need food, and other excluded households. So they're absolutely vital to the way that we construct our operations.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, this is a question I think that would be addressed to some of the points you raised. Extractive industries often have two problems. One is that most of the money is made by outside companies or countries. Two is the climate impact. How can Afghanistan try to use its resources but avoid these issues?
Those two problems are the problems that I was raising. And that's why, I mean, in order to ensure that most of the money does not go to the third country that is from where you have the company that's having that contract, that's why you need very specific expertise on how to draft those contracts. And that's why I was suggesting what I was suggesting. I mean, there's very few entities that can provide that expertise, and I think Afghanistan needs all the help it can get on that topic. The second point on the environment, again, if those contracts are not appropriate, if they're not environmentally sensitive, they will end up creating much more problems environmentally than already exist in Afghanistan. So those 2 points are things that the better Afghanistan is equipped to address those things, the better it is for Afghans, and I think the better it is for the rest of the community. If they can help themselves with using as best as possible their natural resources, which is a gift, then the rest of the world would need to, let's say, support them less. So it will be, that's a win-win. Nobody loses if we help Afghanistan do that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mayar, perhaps you could take this one. What would be the most supportive actions that the Afghan government can take to help NGOs in their goals?
Okay. I would like to comment on the financial mechanism of the climate change. It's different in the other development projects or the contracts that we're signing during the past 2 decades. But before that, I would say that you're all aware of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and one of the factors that leads to humanitarian crisis is the climate change, as I already explained. So this phenomenon is also affecting women and children, especially because as water is reduced, so they have to even sometimes leave the school, the children, and bring water, drinking water for the families. That's one important point. Another one is depends on the amount of the finance that we do or the international community do a country. Underfinanced means underprepared, and it's less investments means leaves the country exposed to this hazard. So regarding the mechanism, the funds of the climate change are not given by the countries of the donor particularly. Recently there was some exception, about 7.6 million were given by the EU, but before that the main mechanism of the climate change fund is the GCF, like the Green Climate Fund, that is organized through the UN, United Nations, and there is another organization, Green Environmental Facility, GF. So these organizations give the fund based on the proposals made with the previously with the agreement of the Republic government to the UN entities or the UN agencies, that's UNFO, UNDP, and UNODC and other UN agencies. So other entities or organizations are not accredited to receive these funds. That's why. So right now the government is not recognized, these funds are suspended. That's why, because it should be in agreement of them implemented. So that's why. So if there is an exception approved for this fund, or also permission is given by the current administration to the international organizations in order to receive this fund for the proposals that were previously made or newly drafted, and then spent in the community, is particularly in the rural part of the country. So that would be the possible way to spend it. So regarding that, the climate change funds are mostly organized through the UN, and that's the amount of the global amount of this fund is $100 billion per year. But from this, Afghanistan is not receiving. Recently, I heard that the UNDP was given about $30 million, you see, in the past 3 years, compared to the $300 million that Afghanistan was receiving during the Republic. It's a very small amount, but the consequence or the impacts are equivalent to that period. So they are giving $30 million to implement on the projects that are related to community centers, not to the link to the current administration. So if the current administration accept or give permission to the other UN agencies or the international organizations to design such a project for the rural communities, it would be a mechanism. Otherwise, Afghanistan will suffer from this challenge, but it will not receive any adaptation support.
Thank you. Would you follow up? Yes.
On the issue of the NGOs, in fact, after August 2021, countries moved out their diplomatic staff, but also a lot of the NGOs closed down and left Afghanistan. In a normal situation, it's the NGOs that are basically campaigning for more funds for particular countries because they're there on the ground and they're seeing the need. And having those NGOs there normally means more funds going to the country. Subsequently, Just re-putting my ex-EU hat on, I'm very pleased that the EU has now got the chargé back in Kabul, so we have a representation, and my colleague Rafaela Iodici is doing an excellent job. I see also the US and other countries are coming back into Kabul, which is basically not recognizing but engaging and knowing what's happening on the ground. The other thing that, again, I was trying to propose before is that we went, the EU from 2000 to recently, we've put 1.7 billion euros of humanitarian aid into Afghanistan. After the events of the, 2 years ago, the development budget has been reduced, but recently there was an initiative that has been launched just about a month ago, which is using our tools flexibly, 140 million euros, which was women for women. And basically, there will be reassessment every 6 months. Are we able to implement something worthwhile on the ground? And then more funds would be allowed. So slowly coming back in, and slowly also, luckily some of the NGOs are going back in, because without the NGOs on the ground, you can't really implement projects. So they're very necessary for any work on the ground.
Did you want to follow up, Dr. Mayar?
I would like to add that recently there are some kind of movements that shows that the international communities also would like to give the funds. There was a conference in Kabul about the water sector, a comprehensive conference to gather the information, and there was also a meeting in Istanbul of Afghanistan coordination unit, I think. So they are trying to study the possibilities of giving the funds to Afghanistan for tackling the climate change. So what I mean is that Afghanistan previously was also lacking the capacity to receive the funds by itself. There were that's why the NGOs or the international organization were brokering the process to bring the fund and implement them in the country. So regarding the loss and damage fund that everyone is talking about, that Afghanistan will be benefited from it, I am not very optimistic, because the same procedure is still heading to that fund as it was for the adaptation and mitigation fund. So Afghanistan was not significantly or sufficiently or proportionally to its consequences receiving funds from the adaptation and mitigation fund. I'm less optimistic or less hopeful that it will be unable to secure funds from the loss and damage fund. So there are 6 to 10 countries in the world that they are unable to receive the fund despite the availability of the fund. So this is the problem that we should address first before applying to the fund, and that is the technical capacity improvement of the countries like Afghanistan.
Thank you. Let me just see a lot of other questions coming in. This is for all of you, anyone who'd like to take this question. Is the problem that we have encountered specific to Afghanistan only, or is it a problem that many third world countries suffer from? And can the same solution be generalized and help Afghanistan and other countries through a singular policy approach?
My view is that there's not one size fits all. Each country has its own specificities, each situation has its own specificities. On the other hand, when we are having, when we are agreeing things on the international level, when we're putting in place instruments, let's say within the European Union, or it's the same thing for countries, we tend to simplify things, because that is easier for us to handle, to have this is the box, and within that box, that's how we handle things. However, real life and reality is different. And that's why, yes, it's good to have these rules and the boxes, but we should apply them flexibly to address the specific situation on the ground. And I think Afghanistan is one specific case. There are others like that globally. Nobody is the, let's say, a picture textbook case. Each case is different.
I mean, if I could pick up on that. I mean, I think, look, the kinds of things that we're talking about are the sorts of things that you would need to think about and do basically in any climate-affected country. They're sort of a generic set of things that you would look and you would adapt in specific circumstances. I think what is actually very specific about this problem in Afghanistan is about this impasse. So the impasse means that the kinds of normal things that you would do, like, for example, providing technical assistance to the government on how they should be thinking about designing their climate policy, technical assistance to the government on, for example, things like Toshkipa, which is this enormous irrigation channel that will divert water away from Uzbekistan and Iran, creating great regional tension. In a normal circumstance, you would have people that would be seconded or who would be advising a government on how that may or may not affect border treaties or other kinds of, international agreements, et cetera. We don't have any of that in place right now. Those things would be in our interest. But the international community, because it has decided it can't be seen as supporting the de facto authorities, is not allowing those kinds of things to happen, even at a technical level. And so I think that this is where Androulla's recommendations and also Dr. Mayar's recommendations about looking at technical assistance again is really, really important. And I think the second thing that's important about it, it is an entry point to this kind of engagement and confidence building that's going to be necessary as the rest of the region and frankly as the world accommodates itself to the new reality that is the de facto authorities in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Actually, we should also look to the past experience that Afghanistan has made. I remember I was a bachelor course student in 2005 to 2009. And if we look to the climate, tackling the climate change issue, it's the COP session started in 1995. So the first decade was lost because of not understanding this problem in Afghanistan. Only from 2011 to 2020, there was some progress with the technical assistance of the international community. How it was. For example, the UNEP, Environmental Protection Agency, environmental program, was supporting the government to make the report that is submitting to the UNFCCC or the United Nations framework from the climate change commissions. So Afghanistan is now not able to support that kind of reports. So what I mean by technical assistance, that okay, UNEP should come again to the country and follow the guidelines of the UNFCCC that is required for a country. Otherwise, we officially postponed tackling the climate change in Afghanistan. For example, I would say that the report that a country is responsible to submit to the UNFCCC is called National Communication, and Afghanistan so far submitted 2 of them reports, while the neighboring countries of Afghanistan submitted already 3, and they are working on the 4th. So if the UNEP or such organization do not work on this issue, it means that the main body of, or the main framework of tackling the climate change, they also postponed their activities in Afghanistan. So by technical assistance, we mean that at least the guidelines of the UN that were signed in 2015 should be followed through at least the UN agencies in order to fill the gap of information. And then we have 7 years left for tackling the climate change to achieve the 2030 agenda. So it means that we made the goal of 2030, but now we are not working toward achieving it. So it means we set a target and then we set again and not working. So that's making the problem. But the main problem is the political, and these are the measures that the international community or the climate-related organization can go through to at least not leave Afghanistan or the rural community of Afghanistan behind.
So we've spoken at length about the various ways in which the international community not recognizing Taliban as a legitimate authority has therefore failed to provide the kind of assistance, funding, and so on. We have a question here that grabs the stick from the other end to ask, how can foreign aid help Afghanistan in the long run, considering that foreign aid in developing countries often undermines development and impacts sovereignty? That is, that donors gain influence in political matters. I wonder if you'd like to address this.
I mean, would...
Anybody?
No. I'm sure going to be more diplomatic than I would be. So,
No, sure.
Since you're a former diplomat, I'll let you.
Ultimately, I think development comes from having associations outside your own country. I am not aware of any country that has been able to develop in total isolation of anywhere else from the outside. So influence, by definition, is not bad. Influence allows ideas to flow. Influence allows development to flow. Influence brings in technological developments that you might need. I think the question is posed from the angle that any influence is bad. Of course, issues of sovereignty are, and rightfully so, important to every country, but the issue of not being influenced, I think is an objective that is not attainable, and if it is attained, it would mean a total deterioration of development of any country globally.
Perhaps this is a worthy follow-up. Given the political, did you want to answer? Did you want to add to this? No, that's okay. Given the political impasse and the urgency of climate change, could one of the confidence-building measures be to involve Taliban in climate-related conversations, such as COP28?
I think COP28 is probably a road too far at this point for the international community. I think that would be hard, they'd be hard pressed to accept that. I think, in our discussions with the de facto authorities at the district and provincial and even at the national level, there is a broad awareness about the challenges that the country faces. They are asking us and others for assistance. So I think technical assistance and engagement around this issue is very much a point of engagement. I think putting them in international arenas, et cetera, right now, it's just not realistic to actually think that would be possible and acceptable by the rest of the international community. But I do think engaging with the de facto authorities on these issues in a substantive way is absolutely a way to build more trust and confidence.
And if I can just come in on the issue of technical assistance, having an expert tell you, well, this is what has happened in this country, this country, this country, be careful of A, B, C, and D, does not mean that they impose their ideas. You take the decisions, but at least you have an expert explain what are the pitfalls, what has worked and not worked somewhere else.
One of the challenges right now, I think, in the country and around the multiple misunderstandings between the Taliban and the international community is that they see humanitarian assistance like many of us see it, which is as a Band-Aid, as something that's not actually going to help the country in the long term, and in many respects undermines institutions that were already in place. And so they're constantly saying, I mean, it's very clear, they say it to us, they say it in the media, they say it regularly, we would like you to help us develop the country, help us work on development. Now, the international community has said, we're not going to help you work on development until you let girls go to school, et cetera. So until you do that, the only thing we're going to do is help you with some very, very immediate needs, perhaps, around humanitarian assistance. So that is the impasse. Until one of those things changes, we're stuck, right? That's the whole point, in a way, of this discussion. It's extremely unlikely that the emir is going to change his stance on girls' education anytime soon. So therefore, it's extremely unlikely that the international community would change its stance on humanitarian assistance anytime soon. This is why we need discussions like this to say, well, what are some alternative things that we could be doing in the meantime that don't go as far as development, that begin to help us create a dialogue and a discussion that allow us to make progress on some of these issues. That is the key challenge. I think all of us are very hopeful, let's say. I don't know if hope is the right word, wishful. We have a lot of wishful thinking, but certainly hope that the special coordinator's report that comes out will allow us to get beyond somehow, at least a little bit, this political impasse. Because right now, both positions are frozen. And when you're in a diplomatic negotiation, any kind of negotiation, you have frozen position, and nobody's interested in exploring alternatives, there's absolutely no way to move forward. And I think what we're trying to do are find the things that we all share in common. Androulla made this point very, very well just a moment ago. It is actually in the international community's interest that Afghanistan, for example, manage its natural resources well and in line with international agreements, et cetera. So we should find those things that are in all of our interests and focus on them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, you made it very clear, the impasse, that one side expects development aid and one side is giving the humanitarian aid. And I also saw it here from the acting ministers that there are such expectation. But I think this is the right place, that we should now consider the climate change or tackling the climate change issue not as a development, because of its urgency on the requirement of the country. If we compromise on this issue and bring it because of the urgency into the between and start with this would be the point to proceed. And this may change the vision or the policies of the current administration. That's one issue. And regarding your question, that participation in the COP, that would be a very representative participation. I focus on a one-year progress. You see, each country who participate in the COP, they make a progress of 1 year bilateral cooperation within the past year, and they present it there and then claim for the future. So now we are just 1 month behind this COP28 in Abu Dhabi. So I think none of this report would be completed, and it would not benefit Afghanistan as much as it is required. But it's still a political will to start initiate the process.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left, so maybe I can ask the most trite yet pertinent, I think, question, and that is, as experts in the field, are you optimistic? Let's start with you, Ambassador.
First clarification, I'm not currently in the field. I'm an optimist by nature. Otherwise, I would not have been doing what I was doing in the past. There's always a way. And if you look for the win-win, which I tried to identify a few win-win situations, work on those. Where is a win-lose, brinkmanship, maybe there won't be progress. But there are issues, and climate change is an issue that can be told everybody's benefit. So let's work on that. So
thank you very much.
Cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic.
I am hopeful because if we look at the progress of the ACG, or the Afghanistan Coordination Group meeting, they understood or realized the challenge, and I'm hopeful that the both sides do a compromise on tackling this vital issue and do not seize the urban, vulnerable and affected communities. I am hopeful that they will reach and start from this
Thank
challenge.
you, Dr.
Yeah.
Dr. Reed.
I guess it's optimistic about what is not entirely clear to me. So let me try to find something to be optimistic about, define the question in a way that makes sense. No, I think that if we could all do what Androulla actually encouraged us to do earlier. She said, what I thought it was very important when she talked about the stunting levels, which is to say, which was a way of reminding us why it is that we want to find a way out of this impasse and why it is that we want to find a way forward, so that it is that we can help the Afghan people help themselves. And I think that if we stay focused on that, we will find ways to do that. And certainly the Afghan people are going to find ways to help themselves. But we need to break through some of these impasses. We need to make many, many more efforts with a slightly longer term perspective to ensure that we're building those and focusing on those drivers of resilience for a longer term, so that we don't find ourselves stuck in a perpetual cycle of humanitarian assistance that creates humanitarian dependency, and that is in no one's interest.
Well, thank you all for your insights and also for your efforts in trying to address these colossal issues that face Afghanistan and the world more generally. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our I'd like to invite Dean Safwan to please join us on the stage. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. Thank you, everyone. It's been a long day for some, a long couple of days, but incredibly important conversation. Really great that we have been focused on Afghanistan. I have had a couple of media interviews in between, in the middle of the day, and the question that kept coming up was, why Afghanistan? And I said, that's exactly, your question is exactly why we're here, because, well, you get it. I mean, we need to be discussing Afghanistan, and, unfortunately, this region is always dealing with crises, and it's very easy to lose sight of the continuing challenges in one corner because of what's happening in another corner. And so I'm very, very glad that we did this. I really am very happy with the conversations that have been taking place, the attention that we've given to Afghanistan and to the impasse. I mean, if nothing else, that in and of itself, I think, is significant and really, really important and much appreciated. Speaking of appreciation, there are a few people I really wish to thank. All of you, of course, for participating and for attending. Friends who have flown from London, from Washington, from Kabul, from elsewhere in this region. Thank you so much for being here with us and for contributing so much of your time and wisdom and knowledge. I do want to single out Professor Arfan Nuruddin, who with Hamid Hakimi played a major role in organizing and thinking through and conceptualizing yesterday and today. My good friend, Ambassador Milan Verveer, and so many that, one of the risks, if you start listing names, you are bound to miss a few people. So thanks to everyone. From my team at Georgetown University in Qatar, Zahra Babar, the person in charge of the Center for International and Regional Studies, and her entire team, in particular Misbah. So a big round of applause to the team. Maha Oredi from the team also at Georgetown, and Trudy Hodges also have really played a key role. My biggest, and to our wonderful Afghan students, I mean, you're the reason that we're here. You are the future, and to many of the students also and members of the American University of Afghanistan who joined us for today. Um, let me just try to briefly recap some of the things. It's really hard to bring it all together, but education is something we spent a considerable amount of time talking about. There's a crisis. There's a crisis with more than 4 million um, students who are out of school. So I hesitate even in calling them students because they're not. They're not officially students. A country with a 50% illiteracy rate, that is really staggering. I think from the conversation this morning, we learned about the importance of engagement at all levels, engagement with civil society, but engagement also with the government, engagement with the Taliban, trying to work on solutions that they can perhaps have ownership of. Any of us who have worked in different parts of the world know that it's very, very easy to earn resistance when you try to come from above, when you take on a top-down approach, or when you try to bring in imported solutions. Okay, that never ever works. And so working with them, working on solutions, working with different layers of society, and trying to argue from within Islam. Really, I mean, that I think is incredibly powerful. Identifying the values that we want to work with and identifying them from, using arguments from Islamic teachings. I think it's really important also to not punish the people, if you will, because we're not happy with the policies of the government. And, Matt, you talked in the last session about, it's unlikely that girls' education, that there's going to be any sort of opening of a space for that, which then limits the amount of humanitarian aid that goes into Afghanistan. Well, who suffers if we limit humanitarian aid? It's not the Taliban, it's really the everyday citizens of the country. So we need to work on all of this. We need to celebrate also the rich history of Afghanistan. One question I had today also, how do you explain the level of education of people like Fatima and others who came on stage, and Hamid and so on? People forget that before the last 40 years, Afghanistan still has a very long and rich history that celebrated women, that celebrated education, that put education at the forefront. Fatima, you reminded us that I think it was 61 years ago that we had female ministers in the cabinet, okay, long before we had female ministers in any European country or in the United States. There's a lot that we can export to the world from this part of the world. So we forget that, and we must not forget that. There are multitudes of cultures and in Afghanistan, centers of knowledge production, intellectual centers, diversity. Islam is a dominant religion, but there's always been practices of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism. So, we must, again, go back to, until we're able to bring all of this back, we should at least borrow from it and be inspired by that very long history. I thought that the climate change is a theme that ran through the entire day beyond the specific focus on it. And that's something that clearly we need to, as an international community, work on. I thought was very, very interesting to talk about sort of the role of Afghans whether within Afghanistan or outside in the diaspora, and the tensions that exist. Those tensions can be healthy tensions. They can become healthy tensions, as long as we remember that we have one goal in mind that we are all working towards. And finally, the role of media and media resilience, which is really a double-edged sword, because with challenges in reporting from and about Afghanistan, social media is there, right? But social media, of course, has its own challenges that are associated with it, including inaccuracies and dangerous misinformation that goes around. So, huge challenges, and we did not fool ourselves into thinking that we were going to come here and solve all of that. But having this kind of conversation is really important. It gets us thinking. It gets us mobilized to do work. It builds connections amongst us, connections of ideas and connections of passions and of human beings. And I hope that everybody found that as important as I have found it to be. The importance of listening and the importance of engagement. So there's a lot to reflect on, there's a lot to build from, and there's a lot to be grateful for, and there's a lot to look forward to. Thank you, thank you, thank you.